Hello, I'm Dr. Octavia Cox and welcome to my channel where I do all things classic literature. In a letter to her sister Cassandra on the 4th of February 1813, in reference to her new novel which had only just been published, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen wrote, she referred to the playfulness and epigrammatism of the general style of the novel. But what does that mean? What is epigrammatic style? So in this video today, I provide a quick introduction to epigrammatism, which incidentally is a word that Jane Austen seems to have coined herself. I will define and explain what an epigram is in order to understand what epigrammatic style might be. So this will be a brief history of some of English literature's best epigrammatists, using examples from Martial, who is a classic Roman poet, but then into English literature using Ben Jonson, Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, Jane Austen, Coleridge, William Wordsworth, and some Oscar Wilde in there too. The William Wordsworth example is really a counter example, but I have chosen these sort of epigrammatic examples on the basis that I think they're funny, and I hope you find them funny as well. What is an epigram? The word epigram derives from the Greek for inscription. So originally an epigram was an inscription on a monument. So it was a kind of summary of a person that would be written on a monument to that person. But the epigram was developed into a literary form by the poets of the Hellenistic period, so from about the 4th century to about the 1st century BC, and particularly by the Roman poet Martial, whose epigrams were published at the end of the 1st century AD. So epigrams as a literary form are pithy, short, often witty, hopefully witty in a kind of 18th century understanding of the term witty, which we'll get onto when I come to look at the 18th century in a bit more detail, but witty not only meaning funny, but a kind of display of ingenuity. And they also have usually a sharp turn of thought within them. So the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms defines an epigram as a short poem with a witty turn of thought or a wittily condensed expression in prose. So that's our kind of modern day understanding of what an epigram is. The inscription origins of our understanding of epigrams, though, still remains to some extent, even if only kind of lightly and in the background, because epigrams are often a short, a pithy, witty assessment or summary of somebody else or their character. So there's still that hangover in epigrams, although it doesn't have to be there, but it is often there. On to some examples. So the Roman poet Martial, who I have already mentioned, specialised in sting in the tail, caustic, acerbic epigrams. So for example, Diaulus was once a surgeon. Now he's an undertaker. He started to practice medicine the only way he knew how. So you can see there's a kind of summary of a person's character in that epigram by Martial. But Martial's epigrams were also characterised by obscenity, both in imagery and also in language. So another good example, I think, is, again from epigrams, Manea, your little dog licks your face and lips. I am not surprised. Dogs like the taste of dung. So we have obscene language, which I won't mention, and a kind of obscene imagery there as well. The art of the epigram was cultivated in Britain from about the 17th, beginning of the early 17th century, and rose particularly to prominence in the 18th century with the rise of neoclassicism. So looking back, neoclassicism, new classical period, looking back to the epigrams of Martial. And an important text in terms of epigrams and the development of epigrammatic style in English literature and language is Ben Jonson's Epigrams, published in his works in 1616. In this text, Ben Jonson describes how he wants to develop the genre of the epigram, kind of away from the style which typified martial, from something kind of personal and vicious and obscene to something broader, wiser, and more philosophical in scope. In the very first epigram in Ben Jonson's Epigrams, Ben Jonson asks the reader not to be a bad reader and to take the time to understand his writing, to read it well. And that's important because, as you'll see when I get on to one of Ben Jonson's other poems in a moment, he wants to prime the reader to be a kind of intelligent, thoughtful reader, rather than to just look for cheap laughs, which is what Ben Jonson thinks the martial style of epigram kind of sought, was just cheap and easy laughter from the reader. So instead, Ben Jonson says in the first epigram to the reader, pray thee, take care that takest my book in hand, to read it well, that is, to understand. The reader, in other words, should bring a level of thought, a level of sophistication to Ben Jonson's epigrams. In his second epigram, Ben Jonson explains how his epigrams will be different from what might be expected. And again, that's probably why he primes the reader in the very first epigram to read this book of epigrams differently from what has gone before, from what the reader therefore might expect. The poem explains that the title, Epigrams, combined with Jonson's name, may lead some potential readers to expect cruel satire or obscene jokes, obscene sort of jests. Jonson claims, however, that he does not seek the kind of fame engendered by attacking and shaming other people or being rude just to provoke, as I've said, cheap laughter. For Ben Jonson, selling honesty, he says, for vulgar praise is too high a price. So let's get to the poem then. So this is poem number 2 from Epigrams, To My Book. It will be looked for, book, when some but see thy title, Epigrams, and named of me. Thou shouldst be bold, licentious, full of gall. So that's what readers are going to come to a book of epigrams expecting. They're going to expect them to be bold, to be licentious, and to be full of gall. So licentious, obscene, and full of gall, full of anger and wrath and bitterness and attacking and hostility. Wormwood, that's a kind of bitter tasting shrub. And sulphur, so they're odoriferous, they smell nasty. Sharp, so with an edge. And toothed, so, they bite. Withal, so all together. So that's what people expect of epigrams, this kind of mixture of all together, these foul-smelling, bitter-tasting, sharp, biting, licentious texts. Become a petulant thing, hurl ink and wit as madmen's stones, not caring whom they hit. So that's Ben Jonson's critique of epigrams, previous epigrams, that it's just someone kind of casting out as much dung as possible, not caring whom they hit. Deceive their malice, who could wish it so? So condemning perhaps the style and those who seek kind of the martial style poetry in coming to this poem and coming to this book. And by thy wiser temper let men know thou art not covetous of least self-fame. So doesn't want to kind of aggrandize himself by throwing dung at other people. made from the hazard of another's shame, so speculating on another's shame, much less with lewd, profane, and beastly phrase to catch the world's loose laughter or vain gaze. He that departs with his own honesty for vulgar praise doth it too dearly buy. So Ben Jonson wants to rid the epigram of vulgarity and obscenity, and instead he wants to focus in his epigrams on the witty turn. An example of a poem with a turn in it is, from the main body of Ben Jonson's epigrams, is number 42, on Giles and Joan, about a married couple who cannot stand each other. And the poem reads, "Who says that Giles and Joan at discord be? The observing neighbours no such mood can see. Indeed, poor Giles repents he married ever, but that his Joan doth too. And Giles would never, by his free will, be in Joan's company. No more would Joan he should. Giles riseth early, and having got him out of doors is glad, the like is Joan. But turning home is sad, and so is Joan. Oft times when Giles doth find harsh sights at home, Giles wisheth he were blind. All this doth Joan. Or that his long yearned life were quite outspun, the like wish hath his wife. The children that he keeps, Giles swears are none of his begetting, and so swears his Joan. In all affections she concurreth still, if now with man and wife to will and nill, so to wish and not to wish, the selfsame things, a note of concord be. I know no couple better can agree." The joke, of course, or the witty turn, is that the couple are actually in complete agreement about how much they do not get along with each other. But Ben Jonson's epigrams look very different, I think, from what we might expect when we hear the term epigram. Our modern understanding of the term epigram and epigrammatic style really comes and is still a hangover really from how the form developed in the 18th century. Epigrams are a way to show off your wit, show off your intellect and literary technique. Earlier, I remarked that the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms partially defines an epigram as a wittily condensed expression. This notion of epigrams displaying one's ability to show concise expression meant that they became particularly popular in the early 18th century, when poetic refinement and polish, as it was called, was celebrated. So this polish was typified in the epigrammatic, condensed poetic style of Alexander Pope, the preeminent poet of the neoclassical period of the early 18th century. Pope sought concision in his poetry. That was one of the things that he thought was the most important thing about good poetic style. And we can see Pope's promotion of condensed expression in his famous lines from an essay on criticism: "True wit, or writing, is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed." So the focus for Pope should be on the dressing. So it's a bit like we still have this language in the idea of dressing a salad. So you take nature, you take your leaves, and then you dress them to advantage. So you make them taste even better by putting a good dressing on them. It's a similar kind of idea. You enhance the nature by dressing it well. So showing nature essentially to its kind of best advantage through condensed expression. That was what Pope thought good poetry was. And as we can see here, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed, there's an idea that original thought, and this is the neoclassical period in in a way, the idea is that everything that's already been said that's worth saying has already been said, and it was said in the classical period. So, original thought is unlikely, is the kind of suggestion. Most things have been thought before. So what's left? Well, the only thing left then is for the 18th century person to work on the expression of common thoughts that everybody has had. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. The 18th century literary critic Samuel Johnson noted of Alexander Pope's tight, wrought, highly polished poetic style, or his wittily condensed expression, we might say, in his Life of Pope, which was published in 1781, that Alexander Pope examined lines and words with minute and punctilious observation, and retouched every part with indefatigable diligence. It's a kind of exacting process of refinement. So refinement is that idea of things going through many kind of siftings until you get a purer end result, or a more refined end result. And that's how Samuel Johnson talks about Alexander Pope's poetry, that it goes kind of through this sifting process so that eventually you end up with just the gold nugget, if you like, after this kind of retouching process. And Alexander Pope himself advised, for example, in the second epistle of the second book of Horace from 1737, "Prune the luxuriant, the uncouth refine, but show no mercy to an empty line." So this is the idea of enhancing expression by removing anything empty. So that's the kind of refining process I was talking about. You get rid of all the empty lines or all the empty words. And what you're looking for then is a kind of denseness. So every line, even every word, has to have meaning. It has to add something worth adding to the line. So show no mercy to an empty line. Then polish all with so much life and ease, you think 'tis nature. In an essay on criticism, so that was published a bit earlier in 1711, Pope had recommended that all expletives, as he called them, that was his word for kind of empty words, expletives, should be removed from poetry. Expletives for Pope are any unnecessary words at all that do not add anything to a line's meaning, but kind of just are only there really to pad out the syllables. And Pope elegantly makes a kind of joke of this in the very line in which he censures poetry replete with expletives. So, while expletives their feeble aid do join. The word do here is itself an expletive. It is completely unnecessary. It's padding in terms of the line's meaning. It doesn't need to be there, and so it should just be got rid of. And this is a very kind of labour-intensive sort of process, that it's not about, when we talk about expression, it's not about the kind of expression of the individual in terms of them expressing themselves, which we might think of as how we might talk about kind of our individual expression or an expression of oneself today. Here, expression is about how wrought, the way in which you kind of communicate, how highly wrought that is. Very labour intensive, very highly edited kind of process. You can see why Alexander Pope's love of pruning his poetry, of getting rid of anything and everything extraneous until you are down to the very pith, the very nub, the very core of what you mean, goes hand in hand with epigrammatic writing style. Some people might regard this as, this highly edited style as artificial. It's a kind of criticism or a description which is often thrown at the style of Pope, that it's artificial and that it's kind of unlifelike. But one might also see it as a kind of celebration of poetic intensity and concentration and density. To get to Pope's epigrams, a famous example of one of Alexander Pope's kind of hostile epigrams is his epigram from the French. Sir, I admit your general rule, that every poet is a fool. And then we have the turn. But you yourself may serve to show it, that every fool is not a poet. So the reverence for epigrammatic style in the early 18th century helps to explain, I think, why the closed couplet came to be the dominant poetic form in the period, kind of at the same time. Those two things kind of coalesced. So a closed couplet is a rhymed pair of end-stopped lines. A rhymed pair of end-stopped lines. So the closed couplet form lends itself to epigrammatic style because the first line, or you might say the first kind of half of the sentence, because a closed couplet will usually be a full sentence, or a kind of a full kind of proper closed couplet would be a whole sentence, or at least have very heavy punctuation at the beginning and at the end of it. So the first line, the first clause, states something, a position or an idea or something, and then the second line, the second clause, turns back on the first line. So it turns back and it reflects on the line that went before. So you can see you have a kind of neat, coherent whole. You have the first line, which states something, and then the second line, which kind of playfully looks back to the first line, and often, you know, with a joke in the rhyme at the end of the line. So an example of Alexander Pope's funny, biting, closed couplet style of epigram is this from 1732. You beat your pate, so that's head. You beat your head and fancy wit will come. Knock as you please, there's nobody at home. An epigram was traditionally a short poem, as I was explaining earlier, for example, in Ben Jonson's epigrams. But the 18th century reverence for condensed expression, the style of epigrammatism, encouraged also by the closed couplet form, which was very popular, meant that in this literary period, epigrammatism was a characteristic feature, actually, of much longer poems too. Take, for instance, Alexander Pope's longer, more serious, philosophical poetry, such as An Essay on Man from 1733. From which we get this famous aphorism: hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but always to be, blessed. So you don't need to read these lines in context for them to make sense. They stand alone as an epigrammatic unit, even though they come from, you know, a poem that is four books long, 4 epistles long. So this epigrammatic, this sort of promotion of the epigrammatic can be seen even in what are, in theory, kind of long, more discursive poems. And I'll get back to this when I come to look at the Romantics in a minute. Samuel Johnson, who valued Alexander Pope's poetic concision in the quotation I mentioned earlier, favoured an epigrammatic style of writing in his own prose too. He wrote poetry, but he particularly kind of excelled in prose writing, epigrammatic prose writing. So this is an example from January 1760, where he declared, for instance, in all pointed sentences, so pointed, sharp, suggesting criticism, in all pointed sentences, some degree of accuracy must be sacrificed to conciseness. So again, we've got this idea of the promotion of concision. You should make, Samuel Johnson is saying that for good expression, or to be well expressed in the words of Pope, you want to make a sentence as incisive as possible. The author must prioritise concision above all else. Even accuracy or kind of the whole truth must come second to it. So some degree of accuracy, so some part of the whole truth must be sacrificed to conciseness. An example of a particularly poignant, I think, kind of pithy, pointed epigrammatic example of his prose writing style, Samuel Johnson's prose writing style, comes from A Free Inquiry from 1757. The only end of writing is to enable the readers better to enjoy life, or better to endure it. It's to kind of turn there at the end of the sentence. It could just end at the end of enjoy life. The sentence could just end, the only end of writing is to enable the readers better to enjoy life. That would be a lovely sentence. But then you have the second clause, or better to endure it. So in a sense, this sentence is formed a bit like a closed couplet. The first clause makes a statement, and then the second clause wittily reflects back on the first clause. So we've gone from Ben Jonson in the early 17th century, where an epigram can be a 20-line poem, a short poem, to the 18th century, where epigrammatism has been condensed to one sentence or one couplet. It's really been refined down. The neoclassical and post-neoclassical period's love of epigrammatic style began to fall out of favour at the end of the 18th century with the rise of Romanticism. And concomitantly, so did the closed couplet form that had dominated in the 18th century. And as I've said, that kind of lends itself to epigrammatism. So what was wrong with epigrammatic style according to the Romantics? The great Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge comically defined an epigram in 1809 as a dwarfish whole. In a beautifully turned closed couplet, which is itself, ironically, an epigram, Coleridge defined an epigram like this. What is an epigram? A dwarfish whole, its body brevity, and wit its soul. So Coleridge here neatly articulates the problem that many Romantic period writers had with the form, that only dwarfish wholes can be attempted. So if you want to capture something in 2 lines or in a sentence, Coleridge argues, then the truth being articulated is probably going to be quite local and quite small, or rather superficial, or rather kind of skirting. Coleridge implies that giant truths, or kind of expansive truths, or just the idea of exploration is beyond the epigram's scope. So in the words of William Wordsworth, and this is my epigrammatic counterexample, William Wordsworth, of course, is another great Romantic poet. So in lines written above Tintern Abbey, this is from the Lyrical Ballads of 1798, he says that he wants to contemplate and write about the burden of the mystery, the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world. That's what he thinks poetry should be. It's about mystery. It's about the kind of unintelligibility of the world and all of it, of all this unintelligible world. It's not about closing something down and refining it to a kind of polished nub. It's about sort of accepting that there are things that are unintelligible, but trying to kind of explain or trying to come to terms with that feeling of not understanding everything. and that the burden of the mystery, that weighs on you, but yet you want to explore it and you want to examine it, and so on. The kind of witty turn in an epigram instead creates a sense of completeness, a sense of finality, a sense of conclusiveness, and a sense of conclusion. The rhymed heroic couplet kind of does that as a form, because you start out and you kind of end up with a complete whole, and it's sort of cemented even more by the rhyme. So you have this kind of series, or at least the Romantics would say, you have these kind of series of small loops. And that is one of the Romantic period's problems with the style of Alexander Pope. So I said earlier, in reference to an essay on man, that it's full of these kind of aphoristic, epigrammatic couplets, closed couplets, that you can just extract from the whole of the poem. And then on one hand, that's wonderful. You have this lovely aphorism that hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but always to be blessed. You know, it's a beautifully expressed aphorism that you can kind of commonplace book in your mind, that you can hold it there and kind of have that whole kind of beautifully turned phrase in your mind. But most people probably wouldn't know anything at all to do with the context of where that came in the original poem. That it's not kind of there isn't a sense. So in Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth talks about rolling, a spirit that rolls through all things, and an epigrammatic style doesn't kind of encourage that view, because it has this sense of finality and this sense of completeness and this sense of closing, rather than a kind of Wordsworthian seeking after all this unintelligible world, this kind of continuation that one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, so that you shouldn't be able to extract, a kind of neat epigrammatic extract from a poem. It ought to be put in context. And I guess you can say, well, you always extract bits from poetry, as I have done today, but hopefully you see the point that I'm trying to make, that it's a problem for the Romantics that Pope's poetry is so easily put into these little nuggets of complete thought. If you want to create something that suggests mystery, unintelligibleness, uncertainty, incompleteness, a sense of not knowing, of continuation rather than neat endings, then epigrammatism is inherently incompatible with that, at least in its 18th century guise. Now, getting back to Jane Austen, who I started with, who was a great admirer of Samuel Johnson, who I quoted earlier. She is unlike some of her contemporary Romantic period writers in celebrating delightful epigrammatism, particularly in the style of Pride and Prejudice. So let us examine some examples from the novel then, and all these examples are from Elizabeth Bennet's dialogue. Early in the novel, Elizabeth Bennet is talking of Mr. Darcy's snubbing of her to Charlotte Lucas, and she declares, "I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine." As in Samuel Johnson's prose, we have the almost closed couplet-like Popian construction, the concision, in having the first clause make a statement and the second clause reflect back on and undermine the first clause. So Lizzie would be able to forgive Mr. Darcy's pride if he had not mortified her pride, which means, of course, that she cannot forgive his pride. Another example of Jane Austen's playful epigrammatic prose comes a few chapters later. "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," cried Elizabeth. "That is an uncommon advantage. And uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintances." This expostulation kind of commences with the idea that not being laughed at is an uncommon advantage, a good thing. But then the concluding part of the speech challenges this notion, turns back on it, on the first observation. by suggesting that actually it is a disadvantage to be the kind of person who cannot bear to be laughed at, and the value of being able to laugh at yourself and others. In essence, you might say that this is at the heart of the epigram in its kind of inscription origin, the summing up of another character, and at least for Elizabeth Bennet, that kind of a wonderful part of the summing up of another person is to expose their foibles just as much to kind of celebrate their virtue and celebrate their goodness. So one more final example. To Mr. Darcy directly, this is as they are dancing together at the Netherfield Ball, and Lizzie says pointedly, for the advantage of some, conversation ought to be so arranged as that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible. And for the most part, of course, one would assume that conversation and not speaking are mutually exclusive. I now want to turn to Jane Austen's letter to Cassandra that I quoted at the beginning of this video to think about how Austen frames her discussion of epigrammatism. So the whole section from the letter reads, the work is rather, this Pride and Prejudice, the work is rather too light and bright and sparkling. It wants shade. It wants to be stretched out here and there with a long chapter, of sense if it could be had, if not, of solemn, specious nonsense. About something unconnected with the story, an essay on writing, a critique on Walter Scott, who was a fellow romantic poet and novelist, the most popular novelist of the period, or the history of Bonaparte, or anything that would form a contrast and bring the reader with increased delight to the playfulness and epigrammatism of the general style. So Austen explicitly refers to the contrast, but what is contrasted with the light and bright and sparkling and playful epigrammatism? That which is stretched out, long and unconnected. So it sounds like something is in need of some pruning, in Pope's words, in order to make it instead tight and short and coherent. It seems that that is the contrast that Austen is making there. And what is more, the contrasting non-epigrammatism is something which is unlikely to be sense and is far more likely to be solemn, specious nonsense. Specious meaning plausible sounding, but deceptive. So for Austen, then, an epigram displays good sense. It displays wit and intelligence, far more than writing which is stretched out, long and unconnected. Austen objects to the idea that serious writing has to be dull and solemn. And in a history of British epigrammatists, I cannot go without including a few examples of the mercurial Oscar Wilde, a writer who particularly excelled in the epigrammatic form. And there are so many examples to choose from, but here are three of my favourites, just from Lady Windermere's Fan, which was performed in 1892. In this world, there are only two tragedies. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. Another example, I can resist everything except temptation. And one more example, a cynic in Lady Windermere's Fan is described as a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. So you can see here that Oscar Wilde is continuing on the kind of 18th century idea that epigrams kind of happen within one sentence, that the turn comes kind of as quickly as the second clause in one sentence, that the turn is kind of quick and sharp, what Coleridge would call a dwarfish whole. Oscar Wilde described his own epigrammatic style in De Profundis, which is his kind of apologia written while he was imprisoned in Reading Jail. He was imprisoned from 1895 until 1897, and then De Profundis was published posthumously after he died in 1905. In defending his epigrammatic style, Oscar Wilde echoes, I think, Samuel Johnson's earlier observation that in all pointed sentences, so in all sharp-edged sentences, some degree of accuracy must be sacrificed to conciseness. So in a sense, you can see that as the prioritising of style over substance. I mean, it's quite a long way away, but you can see it in part as a kind of essence of the art for art's sake idea. So Oscar Wilde wrote in De Profundis, defending his own style, "I made art a philosophy, and philosophy an art. There was nothing I said or did that did not make people wonder. I showed that the false and the true are merely forms of intellectual existence." As I was saying in Samuel Johnson's kind of language or his phrasing, that accuracy is not as important as conciseness. So again, this idea of well expressed or style being what should be prioritised in art. Wilde continues, "I summed up all systems in a phrase and all existence in an epigram." Thank you very much indeed for listening. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the like button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. And do leave any of your own fabulous examples of epigrammatic style in the comments below.